I'm Sylvester Johnson, and this is Vox Humanities Conversations, a live streaming program from the Center for Humanities at Virginia Tech. As with all productions under the Vox Humanities media imprint, the Conversations Initiative places its focus on advancing human-centered knowledge. We do this by engaging with experts and scholars whose work explores human life and human culture through a critical lens, and it serves to enhance public understanding around the impact of social disparity in a complex world. What makes conversations unique is an emphasis on sharing stories that connect us to the humanity within the humanity. For each episode, we invite one or more guests to open a window into the story of their scholarship, both the story that stands behind their work and the story that lives within. The history of Western colonialism is simultaneously a history of resistance to secure sovereignty and freedom from colonialism. Algeria is one country in northern Africa that endured a violent struggle against French colonialism in order to secure its sovereignty. The Algerian War for Independence, however, has a history that remains contested in public memory. Our guest today, Professor Anndal Narayanan, is an expert on the Algerian War and is French veteran. Welcome, Dr. Narayanan. So glad you could join us today.
Oh, well, thank you, Dr. Johnson. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for having me. And I'd like to thank the Center for Humanities for its support of my research. This has been really instrumental in sort of getting me through that last mile of revisions to my my book manuscript. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone who is. Oh, sorry. I also wanted to thank everyone who's joining us on Zoom in the middle of their busy afternoon. So welcome everyone.
Oh, that's terrific. So thanks so much. I'm really delighted to support your work. And we'd love to begin by you telling us what you do here at Virginia Tech.
Well, I have a lot of fun at Virginia Tech. I teach modern military history in the history department, including especially the large modern military survey that is a required course for all students in ROTC, as well as national security majors. So very high enrollment, high intensity classes. But aside from that, I get to teach a great diversity of other courses in military history from about 1500 to the present. Everything from the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars to the global war on terrorism. And given that I'm a French historian, it's really a delightful role to play here.
That's terrific. So let's dive into a little more of this research. You've been writing about the Algerian War, and you've been examining the important role that has been played both by people who were fighting the war on the French side and the Algerian side, and also some of the way that the war gets represented and remembered in public memory. So can you tell us about the importance of your focus on these veterans? What became for you the interest in examining their role, and why is it important to understand the lives of the veterans, both during the war and also in the decades that followed?
Well, thank you for that that opening. First, I wanted to start by giving our audience some context on the Algerian War of Independence, and sort of take my own blinders off and remember what is essential about this history. So my research is basically about how the final generation of conscripts that France would send to war in the 20th century returned home to a society that didn't recognize them as veterans and wanted to wanted to move on from this this very traumatic war experience, and how this experience of invisibility compelled these veterans to engage in and transform French politics. So as you mentioned, Dr. Johnson, the Algerian War of Independence was one of many struggles for national sovereignty during the Cold War, following World War II. France had colonized Algeria throughout the 19th century, starting in 1830. And I think of Algeria in this period almost as France's Wild West. It was a place where, you know, adventurers could start over. It was a place for the French military to sort of redeem itself, or seek to, after Napoleon's defeat. It was it provided a sort of an escape valve for troublesome populations from the metropole who would be resettled in Algeria, prisoners and revolutionaries and things like that. France built its settler colony of Algeria to function via a system of racialized inequality. Most indigenous Algerians were never really able to become French citizens. They were forced to remain subjects. Settlers opposed even modest political reforms that would have allowed, you know, a small number of native Algerians into the political system. So on the eve of the revolution in 1954, there were about 1 million settlers of French and European descent in Algeria, and 9 million indigenous Algerians who were subjects of the French Empire. And when this national independence revolution erupted in November 1954, because the nationalist movement basically felt that nonviolent paths political engagement had been foreclosed, the French state constantly sought to minimize the depth of what was happening. You know, this is not a war for national independence. This is a minor rebellion we need to pacify. This is a policing matter. But through the course of years, the French state eventually deployed the professional army, as well as over 1 million conscripts, young French citizens performing their national military service, which was a mandatory requirement of their citizenship, to fight this growing insurgency in Algeria. This was an extremely brutal, horrific war, and an iconic war of national independence. The Algerian nationalists used terrorism as central to their strategy, because as some of them put it, we don't have bombers. We have to make use of what tactics are available to us. The French, for their part, responded with mass repression, with systematic torture, and with collective punishment. And this dialogue of violence produced a downward spiral, which ultimately ended up empowering the nationalists as France's extremely heavy-handed responses drove more and more unengaged or undecided civilians into the nationalist camp. So by 1962, France, having waged this war to hold on to a piece of the French Empire for 8 years, ended up pursuing a negotiated withdrawal. And this meant that the over 1 million conscripts who had been sent to preserve a piece of overseas territory were returning home as veterans of defeat. um, they would not be recognized as real veterans, you know, as real as the veterans of the Great War and World War II. So imagine as if American veterans of the Vietnam War were not recognized by our government as actual veterans and did not have access to VA benefits. It's a very comparable situation. Furthermore, the French state did not acknowledge that that this Algerian Revolution had been an actual war until 1999. So 25 years after the veterans themselves were recognized. And it was really these two markers that drew my interest to this story and my desire to focus on veterans as kind of a synecdoche for the processing of the memory of Algeria in French society. This was a complete reversal of how veterans had been treated after World War I, where in France they gained a great deal of political power and moral authority, basically on the eve of the victory. Similarly, after World War II, members of the French resistance, those who had fought Germany in 1940, members of the Free French Forces, they all ascended to political power very soon after their wars, in part because they were recognized as legitimate, authentic veterans who had who had contributed to national survival. This is a very different story, however, because it's the tale of the end of the French Empire, and in 1962, France at large was far more concerned with reconstructing after World War II the ravages that still remained of World War II, and this country was resolutely forward looking. They wanted to sort of enter capitalist modernity, and I've concluded that this generation of veterans who were deployed to hold on to a corner of the French Empire, they basically bore the brunt of France's failure to reconcile its imperial past with its present national identity. So that's one of the reasons I find this story so fascinating.
Yeah, no, that's very important. All of those very important points and the significance of the contrast between the actual history of violence that constituted the Algerian War and what you described for us as the repression that the French military posed, the French state posed, in order to preserve colonialism on the one hand, and the ideas of freedom, of liberty, of democracy that had been very much a part of the way of representing French culture and political ideas is very much a contrast and very much a conflict. I'm struck by the fact that you said it was a quarter of a century after this war that France, for the first time, officially recognized that this was a war. is something that is so significant. Yeah. So, what are some of the ways that public memory of war connects these two issues that are part of your research? The experience of veterans on the one hand, and the more recent contemporary development in French politics on the other.
Well, the bulk of my my research in my manuscript traces the history of the Algerian War veterans movement in France. In fact, it's probably about time for me to say the title of my book, which I think I forgot at the beginning. The title is going to be "Home from the War with No Name: The Algerian War Veterans Movement in France," and it's going to be published with the University of Nebraska Press. So I trace the history of the Algerian War Veterans Movement, which is also unprecedented because it was established during wartime itself. Both major Algerian War Veterans associations that still exist in France today were founded during the Algerian War, and this to me is a sign of recent veterans' understanding of how important support on the home front would be in a counterinsurgency of this kind. The movement was strongly polarized from the beginning between a left-wing pole, which was anti-colonialist, composed of communists, socialists, liberals, left Catholics, and a right wing, a nationalist wing of the veterans movement, which was in support of maintaining the French Empire. And so from the very beginning, the body of the representatives of the French nation that had the most direct experience with this war were divided in their perception and the memories that they would cultivate of this experience. Left-wing movement, the left-wing anti-war contingent of the veterans movement, once the war was over in 1962, and they were therefore on the right side of history, they felt vindicated. Their main activism was towards commemorating the end of the war as a victory for France, and they still do that to this day. March 19th is the anniversary of the ceasefire ending the war in 1962, and it was in 2012 that the French state finally adopted that date as an official commemoration date. So that has been a victory of the left wing of the veterans movement, that their narrative, their memory of the Algerian War, that allowing Algeria to become independent was ultimately a victory for France too, has become part of the official national narrative. The right wing, on the other hand, I would say they formed a sort of echo chamber among nationalist veterans, but also among other sort of aggrieved communities who regretted the loss of French Algeria, such as former settlers, former European origin settlers from Algeria, and they cultivated a memory of betrayal by the government, betrayal by communists, of course, and basically they developed a lost cause narrative. Is a very fair comparison to make. And by the time that the far right National Front Party was formed in 1972, the narratives that it would use to attack the French Republic really had already been formed in the right wing of the veterans movement. By the time that the freshman class, the very first cohort of National Front deputies was seated in the French National Assembly, and this was very shocking to observers in the mid 1980s. About a third of them were veterans of Algeria, and indeed the founder of the right wing Veterans Association that still exists today was one of those deputies. So basically, my book examines how French veterans of the Algerian War engaged in commemorative activism to transmit their memory of the Algerian War and what it meant for France. But it also traces the political reverberations of this generational experience, and the backlash that occurred in French politics, which we are still seeing to this day.
Yeah, no, that's a very complex chain of events that you described very clearly for us. So I'm wondering if you could also just share with us some of the paths that took you to becoming a professor, particularly someone who is teaching about the history of modern war. So how did this emerge as an interest for you?
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. It's a very long interest of mine. In fact, I think I first gained an interest in military history in high school, primarily through reading literature about the Great War, trench war, poetry, things like that. Um, I also was strongly impacted by um, the relationship between war and the home front, by growing up hearing my mother's stories about being a teenager during the Vietnam War era, and hearing how that affected her and everyone she knew. Um, Given I am of partial Indian origin, hence my bizarre name. Um, I've also had a long interest in colonial history, questions of universalism versus particularism, claims about universal human rights. Um, so the story of colonization and decolonization has always been a very compelling one to me. So these interests seem to intersect quite nicely in the story of the Algerian War of Independence. Um, I came from a Francophile family. I have some French Canadian roots in me as well, and so I already spoke French by the time I went to college, and decided to become a historian of the French Empire. The way that I seized on this particular topic, however, was that in my first year of graduate school, my dear PhD advisor Don Reed at UNC Chapel Hill, who is a French labor historian, he recounted to me how in his interviews with former labor activists in France who were active, around May 1968 in France, how frequent it was, how common it was to hear references back to the Algerian War, because the men who were working in factories in France in 1968 in their mid 30s had been, not 19 or 20 during the Algerian War, and many of them had been conscripts down there. So this was kind of my way into this story, but I ended up making it more a war and society kind of investigation, looking at how these veterans basically brought the war back home to diverse kinds of political struggles.
Very nice. And what about some of the teaching that you've done? So are there one or two things from your teaching that has stood out to you as especially interesting or challenging or enjoyable work with students in the classroom?
Related to my research, or in general?
Your teaching, yeah, related to your teaching. So can you just tell us about some of the teaching that you do?
Yeah,
whether or not it's
absolutely.
related to your
Um,
research. Yeah.
okay, thanks. Um, well, obviously, not all of my teaching is related to my research. As for instance, we start modern military history looking at the Mongols, which students always really enjoy. Um, but what immediately comes to mind for me actually does have an intersection with my teaching. Currently, I'm teaching a course on the global history of terrorism, which is very meaningful for me. I'm basically of the September 11th generation, and I've been thinking about terrorism for a very long time. I've wanted to teach this class since graduate school, and I'm glad I got to design it here. And in this class currently, one of our major case studies, the Algerian War of Independence, in part because I know a lot about it, but also because I think it is one of the more ambiguous case studies to sort of struggle with in terms of the semantics of freedom fighters versus terrorists, and when is violence against civilians justified? Is torture ever justified? These are questions that I myself have been struggling with as a person, not only as a scholar, for many years. And I appreciate the opportunity to invite undergrads into these deeper discussions. And right now they're working on their final projects, final papers for this semester. And I've noticed a good deal of a good number of them are kind of caught between the varying perspectives that they've been exposed to about this case study. As Americans in the 21st century, they find it easy to sympathize with people fighting for their national independence. That is integral to our national identity as a people. The Revolutionary War. Um, but at the same time, also because their historicity as Americans 21st century, they have this inherent revulsion to terrorism. Um, so I guess I don't really have a conclusion in response to your question, but um, I find it very meaningful to be able to um, open up students to these difficult discussions that I myself have encountered through the course of my scholarship.
That's great. Well, we have one question from our viewers, and it's about whether there's a corollary between the veterans' experience in the Algerian War and that of the wars in the U.S., particularly the Korean Wars. So, do
Mhm.
you see any connections or parallels there?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Jim. My face lit up when I heard that, because it is a very useful parallel. Um, there is in fact a great book that you should look up by I believe her name is Melinda Pash. It's called In the Shadow of the Greatest Generation, and it's a generational history of American veterans of the Korean War. And there are many parallels between that situation and French veterans of Algeria. They both of these cohorts expected to be treated, to return home and be feted, celebrated, the ways that they saw veterans of World War II being welcomed with open arms and celebrated. These were both very, very brutal uh, case studies of modern war, with a great deal of invisibility as to what the combat was actually like. I would say, meaning people on the home front back home did not really understand. They were not well informed about what this combat was like. Uh, and I think the proximity uh, between between World War II and Korea. No, sorry, I should have started that from the other direction, but there's a similar, I think, sentiment of invisibility or of being overlooked among American veterans of Korea and French veterans of Algeria. In the American case, because American veterans of Vietnam took up a lot more oxygen, to put it bluntly, and in the French case, because what they refer to as the events of 1968 sort of overshadowed any image or impact of veterans of Algeria that might have sort of been at the forefront for people. So very, very perceptive question, Jim. Thank you for that.
Well, thanks so much. I'm really grateful for you joining us to share with us your work and for engaging with our audience and just elucidating what really is clearly a complex history that you are bringing to light for students and for your readers. And we look forward to seeing your book as well. So thanks again for joining us. Thank you, our viewers, for joining us for another episode of Vox Humanities Conversation. This live stream show is brought to you by Virginia Tech Publishing, and this show and other media content that's produced under Vox Humanities is also brought to you by Virginia Tech Publishing. For more information about the Center for Humanities, we encourage you to go to the Center for Humanities website. And for more information about Virginia Tech Publishing, please go to publishing.vt.edu. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Conversations, and we invite you to join us in the future for other episodes of Conversation.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. Thanks, everyone. Bye.